So, with all that being said, for those of you who might not know who I am, my name is Blake Rudis, and the Zone System Express came from a workflow that I had been building up for years, actually, a very long time. I started this whole process of really good workflow and dialing in that workflow probably around 2010, when I was having a lot of frustrations with the post-processing aspect of my images. And I knew the camera really well, but I didn't know the post-processing and the inner workings of the post-processing. And it was really frustrating for me. It was actually extremely frustrating for me because I knew what I wanted to do, but I could never get exactly what I wanted in my images. So I had to come up with a systematic approach to workflow that would work for me. So I started deducing what are the most important things in an image. And those things are tone, color, and artistic effects. So the whole Zone System Express panel is a breakdown of tone, color, and artistic effects. And it's a really powerful workflow because it doesn't matter what you're processing. It doesn't matter if you're processing a portrait, a landscape, architecture, macro, I don't care, senior sessions, whatever it is that you want to post-process, every image in the world has these three things. They need tone modified, they need color modified, and they need your artistic expression to take it to the next level, okay? So with this workflow, tone, color, artistic effects, you're going to hear it over and over and over again. It's kind of like a checklist of things that you need to do with your images. So I'm going to go ahead and hop on over into Photoshop. And before I begin, I do want to tell you, this is a little disclaimer, that the results that I'm going to get and the results that you're going to get are going to be two different things when you first start. But there's education there for a reason. The whole Zone System Express comes with the education to get you to a level that you are going to be processing like I process. So you might not get it overnight, but over time and with practice, you will get it. Another disclaimer is that this is a layer intensive process, but not a labor intensive process. And what I mean by that is this does create a lot of layers, but they're organized and they're done like that for a reason. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to switch on over to screen share here. And I'm going to go ahead and share my main screen here. And I'm going to open up our first image for the webinar here. And I'm starting actually with a portrait. So I have a nice Adobe stock portrait that I got here, because you all know that I'm not necessarily a portrait photographer. I'm primarily a landscape photographer, but I want to show you the power of the Zone System Express on even something like a portrait. So there are people that ask me all the time, Blake, can you really show me how to do this on a portrait? Because I see you doing it all the time on landscapes, but what about portraits? So if we pop this open here, this is the Zone System Express 4.0. This is the Zone System Express 3.6. A lot of things have happened and changed from 3.6 to 4.0. But I have to tell you this, that 4.0 is not for CS6. I had a lot of problems in the past with trying to code CS6 panels, and it just didn't work, and it can't work. And I spent hours and hours and hours trying to get it to work so that I could also build the Zone System Express 4.0 for CS6, and it just can't happen. I spent hours. I even lost probably about 2 months of sleep over this. So the new Zone System Express 4.0 is for Photoshop CC. You're going to notice a lot of differences here, but I don't want you to look at this as like a vomit of buttons, because they're in order and they're in a very specific order for a very specific reason. So we have tone, we have color, and we have effects. You see how I've spelled out the checklist of things that you need to do? So I'm just going to go ahead and dive into this. I'm going to give you a nice deep dive on how this panel works. So I would typically come out of Adobe Camera Raw with an image that looks like this. It's ready for further post-processing, and it's ready for me to break it down into its elements of tone. So when I go ahead and hit this button right here, the selects the condensed zone systems. The condensed zone system is a combination of zones 0 and 1, which are your darkest darks, zones 2 and 3, which are your next darks up, and then zones 4, 5, and 6, which is actually a really big spread, because that typically is one of the most powerful areas that you're going to be editing your images in. And then zones 7 and 8, which are your next highest highlights, and then zones 9 and 10, which are your purest highlights. So what I've done here in the Zone System 4.0 is I've added this whole thing right here called Curves Modifiers. Okay, so this panel is actually built so that you don't have to leave this section of the panel. So I'm right here, it's automatically selected zone 0 and 1. So if I go ahead and hit the -3, that's going to make it a little bit darker, a lot darker actually, or +3, it's going to make it a lot brighter. So just really quickly there, I was able to see exactly what I want to do with her hair back there. So for her hair back there, I probably would want to make it a little bit on the dark side, maybe not -3, but something like -2. So when I have it at -2 like that, everything gets a little bit darker, but it's not really, really dark. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I want to be able to darken her hair down to bring out her face. So right here I have the toggle layer button. If I toggle the layer on and off, you can see it actually turns off what's happening there. The really cool thing about this panel too is that right now we have this thing called View Mask On and View Mask Off. If I press this button, watch what happens. It shows me in magenta exactly what this curves adjustment layer is affecting. And if I press View Mask Off, it turns it off. That doesn't actually make that area magenta. What it's doing is it's just putting a color overlay on top of that masked area for me. So I'll turn View Mask Off, and I'll just go ahead and process down to the next mask. So the next curves adjustment, which is zone 2 and 3, I'll just press the down arrow, and that brings me right down there. If you watch what happens when I press this up and down arrow, it navigates right down next to the next mask. So again, that's my dark areas, my next dark areas up, zones 2 and 3. So if I go ahead and hit the View Mask On, you can see exactly what area that's going to be affecting her face and her hair in. So I'll go to View Mask Off. Now I could start by going +3 to see what happens when I brighten that up. And look what happens when it brightens up that area underneath her hair. So toggle that layer off and on. Look at the difference there. So we're really brightening up those shadowy areas there and adding a little bit of depth and character while taking some depth away actually from those shadowy areas. So +3 might be too high, but something like +2, let's toggle that layer back on, +2 from +3, +2, that looks good right there. I think I like that. Toggle on, toggle off, okay? So I'll just move right on down to the next layer, which is zones 4, 5, and 6. If I want to see what that affects, I'll turn View Mask On. That's going to affect a lot of area in the image because it selects zones 4, 5, and 6, which are typically our mid-tone areas. So if I go ahead and hit something like +3 just to see what happens when I make it really bright, which I'm probably not going to do that, then I can go down to -3 and then do something like an S curve or maybe a -1 on there to darken that whole area down. Toggle that layer on and off, and look how that's starting to sculpt her face very naturally, but just by clicking the buttons for these curves. Now what's it doing? What it's doing is it's actually just making a curves modifier automatically. It's automatically modifying that curve for me. So you can come in here and still move that curve up and down if you'd like. But what I've done is I've taken the 6 or 7, I should say, most common adjustments that I make to curves adjustment layers, and I've made them presets so that you don't have to fiddle with the curve as much, okay? So we'll press the down arrow and go to zones 7 and 8, plus that up, too much, -1, S curve, we'll go to -1 on that one. Now, here's something that happens with portraits a lot. We'll go down to the next layer, which is zone 9 and 10, and we'll go to View Mask On. So if you see this, these are areas of pretty high highlight on her forehead and on her nose and on her cheek that are just a little bit too much. So if I turn View Mask off and I click -1 or -2 or -3, you can see how those areas are actually starting to get filled in by a darker area and lifting away the really bright highlights that are happening on her face. We'll toggle that layer on and off so you can see it. Here it's off. Here it's on. Now, there was a portrait session that someone did with me once. They actually did my portrait. And there was just a highlight that was on my head that was just a little bit too much. So I actually used the zone system with zones 9 and 10 to really dial down on what area that was. And I just dropped that curve a little bit. And when that curve gets dropped, it helps round off some of those really bright highlights that tend to distract us from her face, okay? So let's look at the overall before and after of the condensed tones. So we're starting to shape her face a little bit here with these tonal adjustments here. Now, there may come a time where a mask might get a little bit muddy, like this one. So if this mask gets a little bit muddy and you start to see it looks a little bit kind of dingy, it's okay. You can click on the mask itself and you can actually feather that mask a little bit more, and have it just smoothly blend in with all the rest of the tones. And what's actually happening here is when you feather this mask over, it's just Gaussian blurring basically that mask so that it just feathers everything nice and neatly. By default, these will come with a feather. They'll come with like a feather that's around 4 or maybe 5 pixels or something like that. But you can bring that feather up if you'd like. So let's go ahead and move on down. Let me go ahead and turn my webcam off here because I think that might be bothering the screen there. Okay, so the webcam's off so you can actually see my layers a little bit better here. Okay, so now we're gonna go ahead and go close this layer down, and we will go ahead and go into the color zone system. And this is where things get really interesting. So when we click on this color zone system here and run the entire color zone system, we can actually break down all of the colors in the image the same way we break down the tones in the image. With a portrait like this, you might be thinking, well, there's not a whole lot of colors in here, are there? Well, there actually are. If we look at the reds here are typically, let me go ahead and not do a clipping mask. The reds are going to be her skin tones. The yellows will also be some of her skin tones. So we now have 2 separations of her skin tones here that we can modify to our liking. So if we go ahead and hit maybe the S curve on the reds, notice how we can get nice, deep, rich skin tones now by just hitting an S curve on that red area. If we go +3, it's going to really brighten those areas up and give us a whole nother look on her face and help us shape and sculpt her face the way we want it to. The really cool thing about this, and it'll play more probably in the landscapes than it does on this, is that these areas here are adjustments that you can go into the reds of the red channel and you can add more red to it. So if I press this button, it's going to boost up the amount of red in her face, which on this it's probably a little bit too much. But that's the reds in the midtones of the reds of her face. If I do this, that's going to increase the reds in the shadowy areas of the reds of her face. So if we toggle that on and off, you notice how the reds are getting more rich along the sides of her face, and we're getting this really nice natural skin tone. Now with this color zone system, you really have to be careful on skin tones though, because you can really get them kind of messy and kind of muddy, okay? So we really want to be gentle with it. So down here we have opacity settings. By default, any of these curves adjustment layers are going to be set to 100% for your colors. But at any time, if we made a really drastic adjustment up here, we could come down here and say, let's just see what happens when we do 50%. So we can drop down the opacity just a slight bit, toggle that layer on and off, and we're still making an adjustment to the skin tones in her face. We can then move on down to the yellows. And again, we can come in here and do an S curve on those yellows, maybe a +3, maybe a -3. Gets really nasty when we do that. We don't want to do that. It's going to look like alien skin tones. But you see how I said that you have to be really careful with these skin tones so that they don't we don't want her to look like a coal miner when she's done, or a bad HDR image, right? So if we do something like maybe a slight moderate S curve on those yellows and toggle that layer on and off, it looks like we're getting quite a bit of yellow here. So I can offset that yellow by just clicking on the color blue. Maybe I'll do blue in the shadows, or blue overall, or maybe blue in the highlights. That will help round off some of the yellow color cast that's coming along on her face as we increase those adjustments. So we can come down here and we can even go into maybe hitting something like 50 or 60% to taper down the amount that's coming across on her face there too. So then I could continue going down and working my way down this path, but I see here that really I only have anything in my cyans and my blues. So in my greens, I could just delete those if I wanted to make this less layer intensive, or the magentas. So if I go into the cyans, I can maybe do an S curve on those cyans, and look at the difference in that background now. It's almost like we've created a vignette. So we've allowed this white area to maybe be our central focus point that naturally goes right around her face like that and looks really good. So I'm going to close this down. I'm going to do something that I call the contrast checker. And the contrast checker is basically a gradient map that we put over top of our image that's black and white with a curves adjustment layer in it to show us what this image would look like in black and white. And why I like doing that is I like to see my image in black and white first, or after I've done this, I should say, to see what needs to be fixed. Because when I see things in terms of tone, it really helps me push my image. And it also says, okay, that's actually kind of a flat image compared to what we have now with maybe some of these more refined tones. So what I could do though is I can come into this curves adjustment and I can maybe boost up the amount of whites in here if I wanted to just a slight bit. Maybe get a little bit more white in there and just drop those shadowy areas down. And then I could turn off that gradient map layer and now we've got a nice, more refined brightness in our photograph. So this is where I would say that tone and color are pretty good. I'm pretty satisfied with tone and color at this point. Now I would go into something like my effects. And here's one that I want to show you. This is one of my favorite ones, especially on portraits. It's called Radiance 2.0. So when I hit this Radiance 2.0 button, it's going to give me a series of instructions to remind me of what I need to do. But look at how this refines our image magically. It gives us a nice soft edge glow, and the higher we put this soft edge glow, the more rounded off it gets. The lower we get it, it just gets more contrasty. But here we get this nice soft edge, very soft look for the soft skin that this woman has. So we'll press OK, and now it's going to ask us to go into a highlights and shadows adjustment. And by default, yours might be like this. You just press show more options and you get a lot more options here. So you might be saying, well, the color is really not looking right, Blake. Well, if you come down here to adjustments, just bring the color all the way down and that will help round off some of that color. And then we can bring down some of these mid-tone areas in here too, and then refine our tones in the photograph with this artistic, soft-edged kind of look. And I really like what that brings there. And again, there's two other adjustments in here where we can maybe adjust this curve to refine that even more with the curves adjustment layer, and an HSL adjustment so we can drop down that color if it brings on too much color to our portrait. But let's look at the before and after on that. Toggle that layer on and off. There's the before. It's kind of, I wouldn't say, it's very, very detailed looking and not soft edged. Now this might be a good look for a man, but for a woman we want that more soft edged, kind of refined, fine art style portrait. Now we have a series of other effects in here too that we could use. One of them would be something like the matte effect, which is going to really taper down those dark areas in the image, like her hair. So I can drop that opacity down and we have a nice, clean, refined portrait. So here is our before and here's our after. Beautiful portrait to begin with. It just needed some refinement and a little bit of work on it to bring it to that next level. One of the things that I want to show you here is now the Zone System Express includes well, let's do this. Let's do the color picker. I'll show luminosity masking in a little bit here, but let's go to the color picker. So I can actually make a custom selection of anything in the image. So what I'm going to do is I want to refine her eyes a little bit. I'm going to zoom into her eyes and I'm going to go ahead and hit this button here, which creates a custom zone for anything in our photograph based on a color. So it's going to say make sure that your color picker is set to sampled colors, and then you get a color picker and you can pick anywhere on this image. So I'm going to select her eye right here, and I'm going to make this fuzziness go down a slight bit here, down to about right here, okay? And I'll press OK. So that's basically going to be a nice selection for her eye. And that selection is by default going to show at the bottom because it has to pull from that bottom layer in order to make that selection. So we can bring this to the top or you can leave it down there. Whatever you want to do is okay there. But I want to make her eyes a little bit brighter. So because this mask is now set to only her eyes like that and a little bit of her hair, I'll show you how to fix that in a second, we can go ahead and brighten those eyes up. And look at that. Now she's got these very beautiful kind of crystal almost green eyes that are just piercing you, okay? So that'll be good right about there. If you wanted to bring this up in the shadows but not do it in the highlights, you just taper this curve down in those highlight areas and now you have control over the dark areas of her eyes. Now, it did select a little bit more than her eyes. So if we go View Mask On, we can see in pink or magenta exactly what is in there that we don't want in there. So if I click on this mask here and I press B for my brush tool and paint with black, I can go ahead and paint out all those areas that I don't want it to affect, and I see it right there. I'm just painting all the pink stuff away that I don't want in the image, and boom, there we go, okay? So now I can turn that view mask off, and now that's only happening to her eyes. So you can see that the Zone System Express is not just for landscapes, okay? There's the before, there's the after with all of our tone, our color, and our artistic effects that we chose here. So we can just baby step this. Tone, color. We did that contrast checker to refine our tones a little bit more. We did that Radiance 2.0 to really bring out the radiance in the image, or the soft edge glow, I should say. The matte effect, and then we have a custom color for her eyes. Now I want to show you something. What happens if you just skip the tone and color and go right to the radiance? Well, it's not going to be quite as nice, okay? You need the foundation of tone and color as that foundational element to build your artistic effects onto, all right? So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, and I'm going to open up another image, which is going to be a landscape. So I'm going to double click on this landscape image, and I'll go ahead and basically what this is here is I went into Adobe Camera Raw on a RAW file, and I made what I call a low dynamic range image, where I just basically wanted no real strong shadows, no real strong highlights, but I want to bring out the image here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the Zone System Express and go into Tone first and click my Condensed Zone System so that I can really bring out the tones that are available in the image. Now, what you don't see happening with the condensed tone system is it's doing something to get a really natural selection for the darkest dark areas in the image, even though it's a low dynamic range image. It's kind of the secret sauce that happens inside the condensed tones to give me really nice zones to work with that would give me a nice transition from zone 0 to zone 10. Now, you see that big sun blowout in the background? I'm going to show you something really cool here after I'm done with this that's really going to make that just magical looking, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and looking at my condensed tones here, I'm going to go into my S-curve here. I'm going to see exactly what zones 0 and 1 are. It looks like those are the pink areas there. So I'm going to go ahead and make it a little bit darker by going -2, -3. I want to resurrect those dark areas in the image and not lose them. So I might go to -2 and then slightly refine those dark areas a little bit with my mask. And then I'll go down to the next layer, which is zones 2 and 3. So I'll go +3 just to see how much that'll get me, and then -3. I say I always do that, but I do that as a reference point to see what is the brightest area going to look like, what's the darkest going to look like, and then I might go to something like -1 or an S-curve, because an S-curve makes your darks darker and your lights lighter, but it's making your darks darker and your lights lighter of just this zone that we've selected in our image. So what I'm going to do is I'll leave it at that -1 and I'll just pop on down to my zone 4, 5, and 6. So 4, 5, and 6 +3 to see what it is, -3, S-curve. And usually the S-curve is exactly what I want on the image. So I'm going to toggle that layer on and off. And the S-curve looks pretty good to me, so I'll keep the S-curve. And then I'll make my way down to zone 7 and 8. So I'll +3 and then I'll -3. Now you see how there's a highlight blowout back there? Let's toggle that layer on and off. So this highlight blowout layer does not look, blowout layer, the sun, that highlight blowout is the sun, not a layer. But that highlight blowout, it doesn't really look natural right now because everything else is kind of scrunched down in those tones. But I can use that to my advantage, and I'm going to use it to my advantage when I put on this special effect on here when I'm getting close to the end. But let's take a look at this and see what happens when we hit +1 or something like +2 on this and brighten that tone curve up. So if we look at the properties of that curve, +3, +2, +1, S-curve, I think even at like that +2 range, it's a good looking area. So because that is so bright, we need this area in the sky to also be bright. So we just punch it up a little bit, make it a little bit brighter in that tone curve. And then it looks like zone 9 and 10 is really just that blowout area. There's really nothing I can do with it now, so I can just go ahead and delete that layer. I'm going to show you an effect that's going to fill in that area in a little bit here. So now I'm going to go over to color, and I'm going to hit the color zone system and let that run. So it'll break down my reds, my yellows, my blues, my cyans, my magentas, my greens, and puts them all in a nice folder for me. I'm going to take a look at the stuff here going on over. Looks like we got some starting and stopping of the, Okay, so it looks like Firefox is probably going to be the best way to watch this. So based on the comments over there, if you're watching this on Chrome, you might want to hop on over to Firefox or something like that. So my colors are now broken down. So I can press Alt or Option and I can look at that red mask, or I can do the View Mask on, View Mask off. It's completely up to you. So with that, with the reds here, now that I've got my reds isolated, I can choose to do the S-curve. I can choose to go +3, and I can choose to go -3. Look what happens when I go to that +2 or +3 range, especially on this rock over here. I really like the way that looks, but I don't really like what's happening back there to the dark areas in the image back there. So I might just bring this down to something like that S-curve to just bring that up. But here's where the magical stuff happens with the color zone system that I couldn't really show you in the portrait, but I can really show you in the landscape, because this is where you become a painter of that light. So if we go ahead and press something like the reds on the midtones, just bump this up, look what happens. Look at that. I mean, magically, right away. You see the difference there? What I'm doing there, if you look at the mask, if we look at the properties of this curve, if we go into that red channel here, what these buttons do is they either add cyan to the reds or they add red to the reds. And that's in the midtones. Or we can add red to the shadow areas, or red or cyan to those shadow areas, or we can add some red to the highlights or some cyan to the highlights. I really like what happens when we either go like full on red with those midtones. Look at how beautiful those rocks get. And if you've ever been there in Moab, the delicate arch, it's just this beautifully red. It's very difficult to describe, but it's not quite that reddish magenta kind of color. So we could come over here to maybe the greens and offset some of that a little bit by adding a little bit of green to those shadow areas, or green to those highlight areas, or some green to the overall midtones. I think green in the shadows actually looks pretty good, or green in the highlights looks pretty good. And then we can move over and maybe add some yellow. By boosting up the yellows in the midtones there, if we go to the blue, look at what's happening. When we press yellow, it's adding more yellow to those midtones. We go to blue, it's adding more blue to the midtones. Now, the color zone system used to be something of a phenomenon for some people in the last versions, because they couldn't understand this whole idea of mixing colors within their colors. But now with the Zone System 4.0, you just say, okay, well, I'm in my color red. What do I want it to be? Do I want it to be more yellow? Do I want it to be more red? And you can just start adding colors to that, and it's not going to break it. You can always go in here and reset that curve if it's going to be a problem. So we'll hop on down to yellow now. So we'll go ahead and hit the S curve on the yellows, maybe the +2 on the yellows, the -2 on the yellows, -1 on the yellows. I really think that -1 on those yellows looks good. So maybe make it more yellow. The yellows are now more yellow. The yellows are now more red. The yellows are now more magenta. Okay, but that might be a little too much. If we need to, just hit reset curve and we're back to where we started. Pop the S curve on and just make those yellows more yellow. And then we can pop on down to the greens, which there's really nothing in there. And then cyan, which is going to be my sky. So I can do an S curve on that sky and look at how much more dramatic it is looking now. So toggle that layer on and off just to show you what's happening. What's happening is we are making our darks darker in the color cyan and the lights lighter in the color cyan. And now I can come in here and say, let's make those cyans a little bit more blue. And boom, more blue, maybe more magenta to get a nice magenta look in that sky, maybe more cyan, maybe more red. Now you become the painter of light and color on your image, and you decide what that sunset looks like. Not let Mother Nature decide what that sunset looks like. So we can move on down to blue. We can hit the S curve on blue, maybe hit +2 on blue, +1, -1, -2, S curve. S curve looks pretty good. It looks like it's really blue right now, so we might add some yellow to that blue, maybe add some red to that blue. Look at that. Now we've just extremely changed the color of our sunset, but maybe we just taper that off a little bit and add a little bit of red to the shadowy areas of those color blues, or maybe red to the highlight areas of those blues, and maybe cyan. And here you can kind of just pick and play to see what you want the color to be of that sunset. So it's pretty cool. It's like a color palette built right in here, and these are all curves modifiers. So if you're trying to modify something other than a curve, I hate to say it's not going to work. Okay, it's got to be a curves adjustment layer in order for this to work. So let's go ahead and hit reset curve on this one to start from scratch. We'll go ahead and hit the S curve, -1, +1. S curve looks good. Again, these are always set to 100%. So even if you get this to where you want it to be, where you add a little bit more red to it, and then you add maybe a little bit more yellow to it, and then maybe a little bit of magenta to it, if that's too much, you can always just drop the opacity to 50% just to add a nice little wash of that color to the image. And then we'll go down to our magentas, because it looks like we do have a lot of magenta in this image. And those magentas are really in those clouds and stuff. So we'll turn view mask off, do an S-curve on those, darken those magenta areas, and brighten those magenta areas with the S-curve. So I think that looks pretty good. If I wanted to, I could take this a little bit further by adding some red to those magentas, or maybe some yellows to those magentas. Just depends on what you want to do. I'm going to reset that curve, get us back to that S-curve, and then just close this down. So you can see the difference. Press Alt or Option, and look at that. There's the before, there's the after. So I purposely bring an image in from Adobe Camera Raw that looks like a bad HDR photograph. And why would I do that? Well, it's because it's the old analogy that I use all the time. You go into a doctor's office because you fracture a bone, and the doctor says, you know what? This bone is fractured, there's nothing I can do about it. How about we break it and splint it so it can heal back correctly? You may have heard somebody that's had that happen to them, where the fracture is just so bad that it's not going to heal correctly unless they break it and put it back together. That's what we do with these images. We bring them into Adobe Camera Raw, we break them down to parade rest, and then we pull, that's a military term for all you military people out there, then we pull it into Adobe Photoshop, and we build it back up, and we heal it the right way. Break it down, build it up. Break it down, build it up. And how do we do that? We do that with our checklist of tone, color, and effects. So now we can hop on over into the effect area. And I might be able to add something like a square vignette here. And the square vignette is actually based on the gradient tool, which is really cool. Another thing that we can add here that I really love, and it's very selective, is something called the solar spot. Okay, and this is what I wanted to show you, that you could even take these blowouts here and make it look like the sun is doing some magical things. So this is a blown out sun. I'll just press this solar spot and watch what happens. The solar spot, we can move it around when we're in this gradient tool. Look, it looks like a sun, doesn't it? That's why it's called the solar spot. So we'll put it right back here, right back onto where that sun is, and we'll adjust the scale down a little bit, just a little bit, and now it looks like, instead of having a bad blowout back there, it looks like we have a sun that's just about to set and is creeping over the horizon like that. We'll press OK, turn it off, turn it on. It's a very simple gradient adjustment that you can double click in and move at any time to get it exactly where you want it to be. The other cool thing about this solar spot is that we can change this from radial to something like reflected. And look how we have this like beam of light that's stretching across the canvas like that. So you're not just stuck with that being a solar spot as like a circle. Change the style to reflected. Change it to linear. Change it to diamond even. Even a diamond can be pretty cool here with this one. If we put that diamond right there, it looks like the sun is really beaming up and out and then into the foreground like that a little bit. And you can adjust that scale again to make it a little bit bigger if you wanted to get that blowout to be a little bit more. So now we're taking the blowout, which was actually a negative thing, and turning it into something positive with a very simple tool like this solar spotlight tool that we're using right here in the zone system. It's that button called solar spot. This is where you're getting into the effect-based stuff. So I would say that this square vignette, which now has that solar spot in it because I had that folder open, this solar spot actually looked better with that square vignette set to 45%. So let's go ahead and hit that solar spot at about 50% or something like that, 40%. So this is the effect-based things. So look at our color, our layer palette here. Tones are in green, colors are in blue, and effects are in purple. So at any time, you just turn off your effect layers. That's what's happening with the effects. This is what's happening with the colors underneath, and this is what's happening with your tones underneath. So you see how it's really important now to set that foundation of tone and color before you move into any of your color grading or your effects. And speaking of color grading, because I've separated my tones and I've separated my colors and I've modified them individually, it's always a great idea to come up here and maybe hit something like the gradient color grade. Because this gradient color grade is going to add this gradient map over your image and map out all of your dark areas with brown and all of your bright areas with a light tan, and have them be like a cohesive bond of color now. It takes all your tones, all your colors, and just kind of gives them a nice color harmony to work together. Based on color theory, again, we're talking about color harmony, which in the education, I give you a lot of color theory education. You can double click in here because I give you my gradients also. You can come into this gradient and you can change this to any color you want to set the mood of your image. So if we set it to something like this, it's really bright, it's really vibrant. Might be too much. You can always drop that opacity. That's not going to be a problem. And maybe come in here, and if you wanted to really subdue the amount of red coming along, add those blues and those cyans to make it feel more of like a cold winter sunset instead of a warm summer sunset. I was there in March when I took this, so I guess I could go really either way with it. It was actually pretty warm when Hudson and I were out there. But with that color grade, it's set to 20% by default. We could drop that in half and go down to 10%. And here's a really cool thing too, is these layer tools. These are already predefined tools that are set up for you, so you can say, I only want that color grade to apply itself to the midtones. And now it's only applying itself to the mids. It's protecting all of your light areas and your dark areas. Or you can say, you know what? I want that color grade to only apply itself to the dark areas. And now it's only applying itself to the darks and allowing the lights and the mids to come through. Or you can say, you know what? Let's not apply it to the darks at all. Hit no darks. Or let's not apply it to the lights at all and hit no lights. So you have these buttons down here as layer tools that can be used at any time within your workflow. So the breakdown is like a checklist. You have your tones, you have your colors, you have your effects. So you start like this. Tones, you saw me go to condensed tones. Colors, you saw me run the color zone system. And that's just touching on part of it. There's even more that's been added now into the Zone System Express to include luminosity masking. So if I were to open up the tone section here, I could make a luminance adjustment for my lights at any time in the workflow. You don't have to just do that during your tones. So here is my luminance mask for my highlights. This is all of my highlights. But I can refine that selection by hitting right here. I can say Tone Mask Refinement. Because this is all of my lights, and if I hit View Mask On, you can see that that's all the lightest areas and not any of the darks, and it's slightly transitioning into the midtones. But if I set this and say Tone Mask Refinement, it's going to set me up with a black and white image to show me exactly what that mask is. So if I move this over, look what happens. I can get this dialed down to the cloud area back there, and I can decide if I want it to be a really very high contrast mask or a low contrast mask. So I get a really nice selection for that sky there in between all of those clouds. Press OK. And now I have a curves adjustment that can make those areas just a little bit brighter back there. And now I'm really adding some character to this and using tone almost as an effect. See how the difference is there? We can bring that up even more, make it even brighter, make it darker. You don't want to make it darker because it looks really bad back there. So we'll bring that up and make it just a little bit brighter. And I'm accepting the fact that I've got a blowout there. You know, you don't always have to have everything perfect. You don't have to have perfect highlights everywhere. If you have the sun blows out, that's what it does. If you take a picture during the eclipse, everybody's pictures were blown out at some point during that eclipse. The sun is a big ball of light. Allow it to be a ball of light. It's just data in the image, okay? Don't be afraid to let it bleed a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and go through the questions here and see what we've got here. Is this a free upgrade? Yes. So one of the things that I offer during this is if you are a Zone System Express owner right now, this is a free upgrade. So if you've bought the Zone System Express in the past, shoot me an email if you did not get the email to upgrade, and it is a free upgrade for current Zone System Express users, okay? I guarantee it, and that's even the education. So if you buy in now, you're also getting those lifetime updates. Anytime I update the Zone System Express, you're getting the update free of charge. I send out an email to all current buyers. If you didn't get that email, just let me know, and I will get it to you. Let's see, so could you do color correction because of bad neon lighting? Yes, you can do color correction. There's actually a button in there to neutralize the colors in your image. How does your palette effects fit into this workflow? Great question, Peter. So palette effects is the next step. So that's a whole nother webinar. What I would do is I would probably work on one image for that webinar, and I would show you what I do with the Zone System Express, and then I would open up palette effects, and I would show you how I refine the image with my artistic expression with palette effects, because there's tone, there's color, and there's artistic effects. This Zone System Express gives you effects, and very good effects, but palette effects is a whole panel specifically designed for artistic expression, and that's it. It's not designed for the tone and color aspect of technical perfection. It's designed to help you understand color theory. Again, there's 8 more hours of education with the palette effects. So they work hand in hand. The Zone System Express is something I do first, then I hop on over into palette effects, and I use them together in a cohesive workflow. Actually, in the palette effects education, one of the last workflow videos shows you how I use both of them together. Silly question. No, it's not a silly question. See, here's the deal. Someone said, does this work with Lumenzia, Raya Pro, and TK? Yes, it does. Actually, I'm friends with Jimmy McIntyre. What a lot of people don't understand is that I used to write for Jimmy McIntyre's HDR1 magazine back in the day. So what I say about that is, you know, they make great tools too. I'm not going to take that away from them. All three of them make great tools, but they're just different. You know, mine's more of, I think, a workflow solution. I mean, theirs is a workflow solution for them too, but mine's more of like a checklist and follow these steps. Raya Pro is phenomenal for blending images together, and that's what Jimmy Mac does when he blends those images, and he does it very beautifully. His work is phenomenal, and that tool works very well for him. This tool works very well for me. I hand-coded every button in there, so I HTML coded that entire thing to match my exact workflow. I noticed you were leaving mode in normal rather than color when making changes to colors in the color tab. How come? The thing about that is that when you're modifying colors, you're also modifying the tones within those colors. So you can use the color blend mode. If you use the color blend mode, it will only apply the colors of those colors to that image and not apply the tonal values that you're applying through those curves adjustment layers. So if you wanted it to only affect the colors, by all means hit the color blend mode. But what I like to do is I like to use color as another tone step too. Notice how I did the curves adjustment layer to get tones in those colors also. I have a MacBook and an Imac. Can I install it on each, or do I need to use two No, you don't need to purchase two copies. You can put it on both of your computers. I have 3 computers. I have one right here, I have one right here, and I have a laptop over there, and all 3 of them have the Zone System Express on it. So by all means, use them on your computers. Do you use Lightroom as a RAW converter? No, I don't use Lightroom at all. I don't even have Lightroom installed on my machine. Personal preference. I think Lightroom is the rhinestone crutch for my personal creativity. Okay? That being said, it's great for organization, but I know myself well enough that if I put Lightroom on my machine, I will use Photoshop less, and I never want to use Photoshop less. I'm in Photoshop every single day, and I don't want to change that. That's my personal preference, though. I asked this earlier, so I'll ask it again. How are the luminance mask features different from the tone selections? Great question, Philip. The luminance mask makes the luminance channel by pressing Ctrl-Alt-2. You get the luminance channel or the luminance values of your image. The difference is that the tones from the condensed tone system actually select a selection of your zones based off of the zone system. So zone 0 being pure black, zone 10 being pure white. Those are very strict masks. There's no fluidity in them really. But when you use the luminosity mask, you can make a big swapping selection of all your luminance, and then you can refine it down to exactly what you want or expand it out to exactly what you want. Sue is here in Platte City. That was so great. Sue actually came from the UK. We hung out yesterday at a coffee shop. We hung out today in Kansas City, and she's going to be coming over tomorrow for dinner. That's awesome. I can't wait. She's a phenomenal person. Can I say what RAW converter I use? I use Adobe Camera Raw, Neil. So I use Adobe Camera Raw to get me from my RAW file into Photoshop all the time. So thank you, Philip. I think you're the man. I'm going to go back and see if I have any more questions here. Can we keep the previous version on PS until we get familiar with... Yes, Daniela, they are 2 completely different panels. I built them completely separate. So if you want to keep the 3.6 in there, just like you saw me open it up at the beginning, I had 3.6 open, and then I went into 4.0. So yes, you can have both of them installed at the same time. Let's see here. Any more questions here? Philip, man, you made a great little testimonial here. I've been using version 3, and if you're wondering about getting 4, I can tell you honestly it's worth every penny. The videos and lessons are amazing. Awesome. Thank you very much, Philip. Let's see here. I'll go scroll up to the top. Do we have any more questions? Can you do more example with a portrait in the future? Maybe a nice training with different pictures with landscape and a person. That's a great question, Elizabeth. And I think what I'm going to do in the next coming months is I will probably do another live event here probably in November. I think November would be a good time frame for me to do another live event for this because I have another live event scheduled in October for something totally different. So I think I will be doing more with portraits. That'll probably be more on the YouTube side of things, maybe more on the webinar side of things. I really haven't made a schedule yet. I can't make a schedule right now. My mind is about to blow up with all the stuff I've been doing. Will the system work with all PS languages? Yes, Steve. I have programmed it so that it should work with all PS versions. So all Photoshop versions it should work with. How much memory do I recommend for ZSE4? I have 64 gigs, which might be overkill. Most computers that are running Photoshop should be around the 16 gigabyte range. So that's probably what I would suggest if you want to run it the fastest. Peter, yes, I didn't speak about the export tab. I did talk about the effects tab, but the export tab is one of the things that I've added recently that allows you to export for saving as for the web, and also exporting for cropping at the right picture size for printing purposes. Could you use it for restoration? Yes, you could use it for restoration. You can use it for anything that needs tone, anything that needs color, and anything that needs artistic effects. There's probably some buttons in there that you could probably need for old photo restoration, like maybe some clone stamping things, but those are not included. But you can use it after that. Bob, go ahead and shoot me an email, blake@f64academy.com, and I'll get squared away with you. I use Capture 110 as a converter and then would bring in an image as a PSD file. Will this work? Yes, that should work, Leslie. It should work on anything that you bring in from another place. As long as you're in Photoshop, it'll work. Let's see. Amazing. Thank you, Joanne. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. Awesome. I love sharing my knowledge with all of you. You're all great people. I will do that any day. Any day. So we're looking at 8:55. I'm going to take a sip of tea and let any more questions come through if they need to come through. Norm, they do get rather large very quickly. There's a couple things that you can do with those. I use a Sony a7R II camera. The file sizes do get very big. You can flatten them down, and once you flatten them down, you can modify them from there from the flattened image. So if you want to flatten them as you go, you're done with tone, you're not going to go back into it, flatten it down, you're done with color, flatten it down, and that will help you. Or you just process the whole image out, save it out as a JPEG or a TIFF or whatever you want to save it out as a flattened image. Catherine, what about black and white? Yes, there actually is a black and white button in there. So when you hit the black and white button, it converts your image to a black and white image, and then it adds a hue saturation adjustment layer underneath that black and white layer, so you can modify all the colors underneath your black and white. Beautiful way. You're right, Norm. It does defeat the purpose, but that's the only really way to get outside of having your layers build up a very big document. So, is your gradient program in here? Yes, Pat. Most of the things that I put from the gradient course, most of those actions that I made for the gradient course, I've included into the effects section. My email address is Blake, BLAKE, at f64academy.com. Neil, Blake, thanks for all of your experience and knowledge. I've learned a whole lot after working in PS for years. Awesome. I love it. How about action buttons in the next version? Oh, so like putting your own actions in there? I've considered that. Well, we might do that for the next version. A while back, I saw something about color grading. Not sure if it was different from the zone or palette effects. The photo example used was a firefighter. That was something I did for palette effects. Yes. So color grading, the palette effects palette, that panel is phenomenal for effect-based things, especially for color grading, because you color grade based on color theory principles. It's a phenomenal way to post-process your images. So I'm going to go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to redirect everyone in the webinar as I close this down. I just want to say thank you very much for everyone who came out tonight. I really appreciate it. I want to protect your time. It's 8:57 now, so I'm going to finish this out within the hour. Again, thank you very much. It means the world to me that you decided to come here on a Friday night and see what I've created for you. This is absolutely fantastic, and I could sit here all night and answer questions. You guys are absolutely phenomenal. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this redirect button, and it should redirect you to the page to get the Zone System Express 4 if that's something you're interested in. And be on the lookout for emails coming up over the next couple days, and please reach out to me. I try to get back to everyone at a very quick time frame. So email me if you need anything at all. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.